This video is sponsored by Into the AM. Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Kaylee Spaney finds out that in space, no one can hear you scream in Alien Romulus. Rain, played by Kaylee Spaney, hopes to escape the desolate mining colony she lives on with her android brother Andy, played by David Johnson. She gets her chance when ex-boyfriend Tyler, played by Archie Renault, invites her into a scheme to steal cryopods from an abandoned twin space station, Remus and Romulus, using Andy to access it so they can journey to a better world. Along with Tyler's sister Kay, played by Isabel Merced, their cousin Bjorn, played by Spike Fern, and Bjorn's girlfriend Navarro, played by Eileen Wu, they travel to the twin station, but once there, they soon wake the facehuggers on board. You probably know this already, but I am a big fan of the Alien franchise, especially the first 3 movies. They're all done by really iconic directors, and they're all doing something quite different to each other, yet I'm even going to stick up for Alien 3 in this debate, but genuinely, these movies are iconic and scary, and Sigourney Weaver's Ripley remains one of the great screen heroines. She blasted onto the screen in 1979, and she really was a landmark, something that many are compared to still to this day. But you also probably already know that I was not a fan of Prometheus, Ridley Scott's return to the franchise that made his name, and Prometheus was billed as being an auteurist movie, as being a work of genius, and on a visual level, Prometheus looks absolutely fantastic. It's a gorgeous looking movie, and I don't hate Prometheus because it was trying to do something different. I actually praise it for its ambition, but I also wish it wasn't an Alien movie, because the best parts of Prometheus are when it's not trying to be an Alien film. But in general, I just found it to be very poorly written, with incredibly stupidly written characters, and also just not particularly scary, which is a massive failing for an Alien film. And then that was followed by Alien Covenant, which was a nasty, mean-spirited sequel that almost seems like it was made out of spite because people didn't like Prometheus, and then doubled down on it even further by making David the creator of the xenomorph, which is one of those twists that I personally found at the time to almost kind of retroactively taint the original film. Alien Covenant was so poorly received, especially by the fans, that it effectively put the series on ice for several years while the Disney-Fox merger happened. But now the franchise is back in a big way. There's a TV series called Alien Earth, which is coming out next year, but in the meantime, we have Alien Romulus, which was originally set to be a Hulu movie, but just before production was turned into a full-blown theatrical release. And Ridley Scott is again back for this movie, but this time he's stepped back into a producing role, and Romulus is set between the original Alien and Aliens. Stepping into the director's chair this time around is Fede Alvarez, who helmed the Evil Dead reboot and Don't Breathe, both of which managed to bring real horror to the proceedings, but were also fun and entertaining rides. He brings that energy to the Alien franchise, and I think he actually brings the horror back to this series, something which has been missing for an awfully long time. I'm going on an adventure and looking really snazzy while I do it with today's sponsor, Into the AM, and I'm wearing one of their great t-shirt designs. I chose this one because it has a great spirit of adventure to it with a spaceman on it, and it's especially fitting given that this is an Alien Romulus review, although hopefully he's encountering less malevolent aliens in this case. But Into the AM have a whole host of memorable, striking designs to choose from, and honestly, it was quite hard for me to pick between them. Maybe the clincher in this case is that this one glows in the dark. If you'd like to get yourself a t-shirt like this one, you can go to my affiliate link, intotheam.com/filmbrain, which will give you 10% off, as well as supporting my channel. And thank you again to Into the AM for sponsoring this video. It's pretty clear early on that this is a massive tribute to the whole Alien saga. When the 20th Century Studios logo pops up at the beginning, it holds the note in the same way that Alien 3 does, but also the opening credits replicate the font and style of the original 1979 1989 film. The film is absolutely loaded with callbacks and nods to the earlier films, both big, stinking obvious ones, but also small ones as well, like the shoes that Rain wears are the Reeboks that Ripley wears in Aliens, and so on and so forth. You could spend the entire movie looking for them. This especially applies to the production design, which is absolutely fantastic. It does a phenomenal job of replicating the look and texture of the original Alien. It feels like it's set in that world. It has that kind of working class, grimy, grungy feel that was so important to that movie. It makes it feel like it's a really inhabited world. And that even includes little details like graphics on the monitors, which are intentionally dated. They intentionally look like 70s CRT graphics, which is something that really annoyed me about Prometheus, which is meant to be set decades earlier, but they're running around with these complicated 3D graphics. It's almost like going from Prometheus to Alien, somehow the technology regressed. It's an important thing in terms of continuity. It's a small detail, but it means a lot, and the fact that that was actually recognised in Romulus actually brought me quite a bit of goodwill. It feels like we're back in the world of Alien in a way that we haven't been in an awfully long time, since probably Alien 3, in fact, since even Resurrection feels like a very different movie to the 3 films that came before it. But moreover, it feels like Alvarez's celebration of Ridley Scott in general, because there's so many echoes of Blade Runner in here as well, which of course makes sense, because those movies share so much of the same DNA. But still, the opening scenes on the overcrowded mining colony that is in permanent darkness with no sunlight that Rain and Andy are trying to escape from, it feels like something that could have come from the world of Blade Runner, even though those films are not in the same continuity as each other. It is worth noting though, while we're talking about that mining colony, the sound mixing in Romulus feels off in the first 20 minutes, and I thought that might have been just me, but I've seen several people talking about it at this point. It clears up once they reach the twin station, but the crowd noise in those early scenes, and especially because they do a lot of subjective sound, like filtering it through microphones and so on and so forth, it makes the dialogue really hard to hear, especially because that's actually quite important character dialogue. We're meant to be trying to connect with these characters very early on, but we're struggling to actually hear them, and I found that to be a bit of a frustration. I thought for a moment my cinema speakers were broken, but then there was an exposition scene, and suddenly it was pin-sharp dialogue, and I suddenly realised, no, that's not the cinema's fault, that's the mixing's problem. Luckily though, that largely clears up for much of the rest of the movie, aside from one sequence much later on. But while this is definitely trying to evoke a lot of Ridley Scott, this is undoubtedly a Fede Alvarez movie that has a lot in common, in my opinion, with Don't Breathe. The setup in particular of a group of thieves breaking in somewhere so they can try and steal their way to a better life is very similar between the two films. It just has a sci-fi twist this time around. Even Kaylee Spaney's Rain feels quite similar to Jane Levy's character in Don't Breathe, and I'm not saying that as necessarily a criticism, but more as an observation in general. It feels like Alvarez is taking what he knows works and applying it to this franchise. And if you saw Don't Breathe or his Evil Dead movie, you know that Alvarez knows how to stage a proper haunted house movie. It's just one of those, but with a slimy alien skin over it. And in many ways, this takes the franchise back to basics as a scare machine. Prometheus and Covenant were all about the big, lofty, existential questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? Who are our creators? And Romulus really isn't caring about that. What it wants to deliver is roller coaster thrills, really put you on the edge of your seat. It's great to see an alien movie that genuinely feels scary and unsettling again, skillfully building tension with some real jolts. I jumped in my seat several times, and I don't usually do that in horror films these days. In fact, Alvarez is particularly good at that classic alien moment where you're watching one character in the foreground, and then you just look slightly beside them and you realise, oh, the xenomorph has actually been there the entire time. It's been hiding in the darkness in plain sight. And that is particularly unsettling in a darkened cinema where you feel like it could pop out behind your seat at any time. And Alvarez is particularly fixated on the face huggers in this movie, which, truth be told, have absolutely terrified me since childhood. They really creep me the hell out, those little buggers. And so, of course, Alvarez puts them front and centre in this movie. There are several set pieces built around them. There's one in a rapidly flooding chamber that is particularly jumpy in both senses, with the facehuggers trying to latch onto people's faces, and you get really tight close-ups of the legs trying to wrap themselves around them and force their way down their throats that really play up the yuck factor. Again, completely unsurprising if you saw Don't Breathe or his Evil Dead movie, which both try to push the envelope, both try to go against good taste. There's another sequence later on where the characters have to try and walk through a corridor that is infested with face huggers that is very suspenseful in its own right. The corridor was heated to match the characters' body temperatures to try and obscure them from the face huggers, but they still have to try and control themselves and make their way very slowly through it. The characters may be trying not to sweat, but I most certainly was, and it feels like the temperature in the cinema is also rising at that particular moment. Alvarez keeps upping the stakes and upping the danger in the same way that he does in his previous movies, and it's all really well directed. However, Romulus replicates some of the problems that Alvarez has had in the past, in that I think that he's a great horror director. He knows how to handle that stuff, but he's not a great storyteller, and he's usually quite weak with characterization, and you see this in the movie, especially with the supporting cast. Don't Breathe had a very small cast. It had, 4 main characters? Stretching that across 6 characters now means that you get several that feel quite underwritten. They largely feel functional. They feel like they're there for the sake of the plot. Like Isabella Merced, she's got a character that is just simply there to be pregnant because that's a plot point and to scream the entire time. And the other characters largely get the one note to play. In some ways, an Alien movie can feel a bit logistical, like, oh, these are the people that are going to die, you need this person because they're going to get face hugged, and so on and so forth. But it really does stand out when you compare it to Alien, where everyone in the cast was memorable and felt developed. You know, you think back on the original movie and you think of all the great character actors they had there, like Harry Dean Stanton, Yaphet Kotto, and John Hurt, and Ian Holm. They all stand out, but I do think the movie is working against them, both in terms of the script, but also because the opening of the movie feels a little bit choppy to me. It feels like the movie rushes its way to get off that mining colony and get to the proper story, get to the alien, but that comes at the expense of the characters. Still, it would have been nice to give them a bit more of a sense of who they are before this all happens. There's a long build-up and setup here, but it's not really given to the characters. Of course, by far the most fully developed characters in the film are Rain and Andy. The relationship between them is the heart of the film. And Kaylee Spaney, who's been having an absolutely terrific year between this, Priscilla, and Civil War, she is very much the designated Ripley in the role of Rain. That's something that's been in all of these movies ever since Weaver passed the torch, but she actually stands up to that mantle. She has that Sigourney Weaver energy, that resilience and toughness, even though she is absolutely frightened out of her wits. She's been orphaned at a very young age, and so she has to be self-reliant, she has to be self-sufficient, she knows how to handle herself, and she knows how to try and get herself out of trouble and engineer solutions. And Spaney is very likeable, and she carries so much of this movie, but also she carries the emotional moments that are occasionally offered. Like when they first leave the mining colony, there's a really wonderful moment where they actually see the sun for the first time, and Rain's reaction in particular is beautiful. There's a brief passing moment of genuine happiness and exploration, that the world feels open, and that again feels like it's sort of in keeping with the Alien franchise. And again, we're getting this recurring thing that seems to be very common in Alien movies now, where the most interesting character in the movie is the android character. We had this with David, that Ridley Scott was very fixated by, and David Johnson absolutely steals the whole film. He clearly has the best part here. Certainly, it's the most complicated character. Andy is a very old model of android that was programmed by Rain's father to serve as her protector, to serve as her brother. Andy has a very sympathetic characterization that evokes something like Lance Henriksen's performance as Bishop in Aliens, but he's also a quite childlike character. He is someone that's meant to be looking out for Rain, but often it feels like Rain is looking out for him. It does feel like he's a vulnerable character that's almost being exploited, and then the character takes some unusual turns over the course of the movie, where suddenly the character gets competent, but also starts showing a darker, more complicated side that adds a bit of tension to the relationship between Rain and Andy, and you can feel Johnson slipping between the two modes of this character, and the way that he does so is so brilliantly handled. I was absolutely compelled by his performance. He's someone that you genuinely are rooting for, but you're also kind of rooting against at the same time. It's definitely the character that feels by far the most fleshed out. But around the time where that shift happens, another one is happening as well with the film in general, in that it starts getting much messier in its second half, especially because you can start to feel the influence of Ridley Scott on the proceedings. It almost feels like he's kind of tapping his fingers on Alvarez's shoulder, dictating what story points there are, because while this is billed as being a throwback Alien film, it also turns out there's a bit of Prometheus DNA creeping in as well, and depending on your feelings about that movie, that might not necessarily be a good thing, especially as it tries to connect that with the original Alien films. And while largely it's using elements from those films more as just catapults for more horror set pieces, it's still something that I didn't really want out of this movie personally, because I'm not a big fan of Prometheus or Covenant. But it's also around this point where I feel like Alvarez starts to lose control of the references and callbacks to the earlier films, because while they're fairly fun and subtle at first, by the time the second half of the movie rolls around, they start becoming really overt. I feel like the film gets very carried away with itself, with calling back to earlier Alien films in a way that I think is quite distracting and a little bit detrimental to the film's own identity. At times, it feels like a highlight reel of previous Alien movies, especially because there's a chunk of the film blatantly restaging entire sequences from Aliens, which in the continuity of this film hasn't even happened yet, but that's purely there for the sake of the audience. Those kind of callbacks and references, they start becoming very self-indulgent and just so pronounced that you can clearly tell it's just there for the fan service, for the fans to recognise them. It takes you out of the moment, and unfortunately, Romulus does that at several points. In Alvarez's defence, what I will say is that there are moments where he deliberately evokes callbacks to earlier films. There's a lift shaft sequence which evokes the certain moment from Aliens, but then Alvarez puts his own spin on it. He puts a twist on it. He escalates it and builds it even further so that it becomes its own thing. And that's how you do this. That's how you make a callback and reference into something new. You add to it. But unfortunately, for every time that Alvarez does something a bit fun with the mythology of the franchise, he'll then do something incredibly clumsy, like calling back to one of the most famous lines in movie history, said by a character that makes absolutely no sense for him to say that. And also, why would he even say that? Like, has he seen the movie Aliens? What on earth? And you can just almost feel the audience groan as he delivers the punchline. You know, you just could have left it. You just could have left it as just that reference there. No, you have to finish the rest of the line. Oh, great. That was really awful. The final 20 minutes of the film were a bit of a disaster in my opinion. It does a lot of choices that I don't think really work. Not least of which because it all feels unnecessary. It feels like the film is wrapping up by that point. The story's effectively over. The audience is expecting the credits to roll at any moment. But then it turns out that Alvarez brings a whole other scare sequence on top of it. And this is meant to be the climax of the movie, but it just feels like extended epilogue. He's trying to do something unique and original, but really he's stepping in the footsteps of Alien Resurrection, but it also evokes one of the most distasteful sequences from Alien vs. Predator Requiem, both films that you probably shouldn't be evoking the memory of, and the finale is technically well executed by Alvarez. Again, he knows how to handle horror set pieces, but on a story point of view, it feels gross in a bad way. It's confusing for the audience, and I feel like it's going to repulse audiences more than actively scare them. It's a poor choice, in my opinion, and it ends the movie on a sour note. Okay, spoiler warning for the next part of the review, because there is no way of talking about a major issue with the film without just outright saying it. And I'm not going to bat around the bush with regards to this particular thing, because it's not a small part of the movie at all. So if you want to go in cold, skip ahead to this time. But I think most people probably know exactly what I'm talking about. So about a third of the way into the film, they revive the science officer android on Remus named Rook, who, as it turns out, is the same model as Ash, which means the film effectively revives in turn the late Ian Holm, who died in 2020. Now, Rook is credited as being played by Daniel Bett, with Holm being credited as reference, both vocally but also visually, and I believe that this is an amalgamation performance in that they've obviously done some digital synthesis where they've put Bett's voice with Holmes and merged it together. I believe they've also included some animatronics that are meant to look like Ian Holm. It also feels like they've applied a CGI deepfake on top of Rook, which is never remotely convincing. It is super distracting throughout the entire film because it feels like Rook's face isn't actually attached to his face. It feels vaguely like it's floating off of it. But even if it had the best CG in the world, again, why do we have to resurrect dead people in legacy franchises? This is very much in the tradition of Harold Ramis in Ghostbusters Afterlife, which I was absolutely fuming about, and Peter Cushing in Rogue One. And every time I bring something like this up, someone will come to the defense of it going, well, it was done with the involvement of their estate. But that doesn't make it any less bad taste. It just means they've done the bad choice in the most ethical way possible. But there's so many better ways of doing something like this that doesn't require digital necromancy to try and bring an actor effectively back from the dead. And yeah, they've tried to excuse this in interviews saying, oh, well, Ian Holm felt shunned by Hollywood after his Parkinson's diagnosis. But the man is dead. He should be left to rest in peace. This performance, it's a hollow facsimile. It's a hollow facsimile of what he might have done in the part, and it's a hollow facsimile of work he did in a movie back in 1979. Even if you wanted to evoke the character of Ash, there are so many better ways they could have done this. Like, the fact the android is already damaged means you could have the face be damaged, so it resembled Ian Holm, but it didn't look totally like him, and that could be kind of creepy. But also, Daniel Bett looks a lot like Ian Holm. You could just apply facial prosthetics and it would look far better. It would certainly age a lot better because the effects aren't even good now, let alone in a few years' time. Look, we've been recasting actors since time immemorial. Audiences are familiar with it, they accept it, and they understand the reasons for it, especially in cases where people have died. There is absolutely no excuses for bringing people back from the dead. None. It's just there for cheap nostalgia. It's a solution to something that wasn't even a problem in the first place. But even if recasting was an argument at any point, it has been settled so many times over. You look at what they did in Doctor Sleep. Doctor Sleep did recasting on a just seamless scale. No CGI whatsoever, just good casting and makeup. But also it's an android, so it doesn't even have to look like Ash. It could be a totally new character, just running the same software that Ash was. Or maybe it could be another variant of Walter or David, although again, that probably links it more to Prometheus than I would like. Or it could be another variant of Andy. There are so many other choices the filmmakers could have taken with this particular character. This is not a small role. This is one of the main antagonists of the movie that isn't the alien. He is a big part of the movie. He's delivering whole chunks of exposition in scenes that are fairly lengthy. He has a substantial amount of screen time, and that only adds insult to injury, because you've not only revived a dead man, you've also made him a major component of the entire movie. The other examples like Harold Ramis or Peter Cushing, at least they were in maybe a scene or two, whereas this is actively building an entire performance around someone that has passed on. I feel like that particular choice is really unforgivable. Alien Romulus is the most I've enjoyed a film I felt so conflicted on. It does so many things right in how it looks and sounds like Alien and is genuinely scary. You can tell that Alvarez is a massive fan of these movies and his passion for it is all over Romulus. But it also does so many things wrong, especially as it gets overwhelmed by all the fan service, but that one particular choice really is absolutely egregious. That is a shameful choice that I wish the film didn't do. Generally, I think that Alien fans will enjoy themselves, but I also think it works for a new, young audience. These are quite young characters at the centre of this film, and that's very much a deliberate choice. I feel like it's meant to be an introduction to the Alien films for Gen Z, and I think it will work in that regard. It does work as a thrill ride, and I do think it'll invite them to go back and see the older movies, and if it does that, it has done its job. And I will begrudgingly say, with all my reservations about it, it's probably the best new Alien film in literally decades, and proves there is still life in the old chestburster yet. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page or with YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can give me a free hug over at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can also join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can simply like, share and subscribe, it all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.